December 1944. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes were quiet, too quiet. The Allies believed the German army was broken, retreating, finished. Then before dawn on December 16th, the silence shattered. Artillery thundered across the horizon. Tanks rolled through the fog. Hitler had launched his final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. In that chaos, amid the confusion of frozen roads and broken radio lines, one man, a young American artillery officer, would make a decision that changed everything. His name was Lieutenant Colonel William McCaffrey, commander of an artillery battalion attached to the 106th Infantry Division. He wasn't a general, he wasn't famous, but his actions would stop one of the most dangerous German breakthroughs of the war. When the first reports came in, they sounded unbelievable. Entire U.S. positions wiped out, bridges captured, tanks pushing deep into Allied lines. McCaffrey's artillery unit was positioned near St. Vith, a critical crossroads that, if lost, would open the road straight to the Meuse River and beyond, to Antwerp. As the German attack intensified, McCaffrey faced an impossible situation. His artillery was cut off from higher command. Ammunition was running low, and the roads were jammed with retreating infantry and shattered vehicles. But instead of falling back, he decided to hold the line with his guns. He ordered his batteries into new positions, hidden among the trees, overlapping their fields of fire. Without proper maps or coordinates, his men relied on experience and instinct. They set up range stakes in the snow, calculated trajectories by hand, and prepared to fire at anything that moved. When the German panzers came into view, McCaffrey's artillery opened up. It wasn't precision fire, it was survival fire. Round after round fell on the advancing columns, shattering trucks, tanks, and supply convoys. The forest lit up like lightning. German commanders, stunned by the sudden resistance, halted to regroup. That hesitation, just minutes long, gave the American infantry time to reorganize. McCaffrey's guns had bought them life. By the end of that first day, the Battle of the Bulge was already raging across a 50-mile front. The Germans had the weather, the surprise, and the numbers. But in small, desperate corners like McCaffrey's position, stubborn men with frozen hands and burning courage were refusing to give ground. What they didn't know yet was that the fate of the entire Ardennes front, and perhaps the war in Western Europe, would depend on those who stood their ground when retreat was the only option. By the morning of December 17th, the snow was falling hard, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. For the German army, this was perfect. The overcast skies grounded Allied aircraft, which meant their tanks could move without fear of American fighter bombers. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel was pushing west, and its spearhead, the elite Panzer Lehr Division, was closing in on St. Vith. In the fog and snow, Lieutenant Colonel William McCaffrey and his artillerymen could hear the sounds of battle closing in. Engines growling, tracks clanking, bursts of machine gun fire echoing through the trees. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off. But McCaffrey refused to move his batteries. His orders were simple: hold the line until ordered otherwise. His men were exhausted and half frozen, their gloves stiff with ice. They had been firing almost continuously for 24 hours. Ammunition was nearly gone, and resupply was impossible. Still, the guns, the big 155mm howitzers, kept roaring. At one point, a German armored column tried to cross a clearing less than a mile away. McCaffrey's forward observers spotted movement through the mist and called in fire. Within minutes, high explosive shells crashed down on the clearing, scattering the tanks and halting the advance. It wasn't just luck. McCaffrey had studied the terrain for days before the attack, memorizing every road, ridge, and forest line. He knew exactly where the enemy would move. By afternoon, German infantry began probing his position. The snow muffled their approach, but McCaffrey's men had already zeroed in their guns on likely routes. When the first squads appeared, they were met with a storm of shrapnel and snow. Elsewhere along the front, American units were collapsing. The 106th Infantry Division had been shattered. Entire regiments were surrendering near Schnee-Eifel. But at St. Vith, McCaffrey's stubborn artillery battalion continued to fight on, firing until the barrels of their guns glowed red. They had become an island of resistance in a sea of chaos. And because of that, every German unit heading west had to stop, even briefly, to deal with them. That delay proved priceless. Each hour McCaffrey held out meant more time for reinforcements to arrive. The 7th Armored Division was rushing in from the north, the 9th Armored from the south. If they could reach St. Vith before it fell, they could turn the German advance into a trap. But time was running out. By nightfall, McCaffrey's artillery was surrounded on 3 sides. The Germans knew exactly where he was, and they were preparing to crush him. In his war diary that night, McCaffrey wrote just one line: "If they come, we'll make them pay for every yard." The next morning, December 18, 1944, dawned gray and bitterly cold. The forests of the Ardennes were filled with the sound of engines, the deep, metallic growl of German tanks. McCaffrey's men knew what that meant. The enemy was regrouping for a full assault. McCaffrey climbed onto a snow-covered rise overlooking the valley. Through his binoculars, he could see movement, dark shapes weaving between the trees, dozens of them, panthers, half-tracks, and trucks. The Germans were preparing to push straight through his position to reach the roads west of St. Vith. His battalion had no infantry support left, only the artillerymen, their guns, and a handful of riflemen from retreating units who had stayed behind to help. They dug foxholes, cleared snow from firing lanes, and waited. The radio crackled with reports, German columns advancing in strength, American positions falling back. But McCaffrey's reply was always the same: "We stay." The first shells of the German barrage came at dawn. Mortars, artillery, even Nebelwerfers, the terrifying multi-barrel rocket launchers, whose howling noise earned them the nickname Screaming Mimes. The ground shook violently. Snow fell from the trees in waves. Yet McCaffrey's men held their fire. They had dug in deep, their guns camouflaged under netting and white tarps. When the German infantry emerged from the tree line, confident that they had suppressed the defenders, McCaffrey gave the order. The first American shell landed squarely in the middle of the advancing formation, then another and another. The field erupted in explosions. German soldiers dove for cover, shouting through the smoke. But there was no cover, only open ground and snow. By noon, the Germans changed tactics. Tanks rolled forward, using their armor as shields. McCaffrey's gunners switched to armor-piercing rounds. The recoil slammed through the frozen soil as shells screamed downrange, striking metal and sending up plumes of black smoke. One Panther made it within 400 yards before a direct hit from a 155mm shell tore through its side, blowing the turret clean off. The wreck burned for hours, lighting up the snow like a pyre. The Germans pressed again and again, each time beaten back. But the cost was rising. McCaffrey's ammunition was dwindling fast. His supply lines had been cut, and the trucks carrying more shells had been destroyed miles behind the lines. By nightfall, the snow had turned red in places. The artillerymen worked by hand lanterns, sweating despite the cold. Some guns were frozen in place, their recoil mechanisms jammed by ice. Still, they kept firing. McCaffrey moved from gun to gun, steadying his men. He never raised his voice, never showed fear. To them, he was unshakable, a man who believed that their stand mattered, even if no one else would ever know their names. As darkness fell, a runner arrived from division headquarters with a grim message. "You are surrounded. Hold as long as possible. Help is coming, but not tonight." McCaffrey folded the note, put it in his pocket, and turned back toward the guns. Then he gave his only order of the night: "Keep them off the bridge." The night of December 18th into the 19th was one of the coldest on record. Temperatures dropped below freezing, the snow hardened into ice, and the battlefield grew eerily silent, except for the distant rumble of engines and the occasional snap of a rifle shot echoing through the forest. McCaffrey's men were exhausted. They had fired nearly all their ammunition, rationed food and water, and fought through blistering cold without sleep. Yet none of them abandoned their posts. They knew the bridge behind them, a simple Bailey bridge over a frozen creek, was now the only way for retreating American forces to escape the encirclement. McCaffrey walked the line, his boots crunching through the snow. The men saluted him quietly as he passed. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. Most were covered in soot and frost, their faces blackened from powder burns. They were artillerymen turned infantry, engineers turned defenders of the last road west. In the distance, flares illuminated the tree line. German patrols probing for weaknesses. McCaffrey ordered his men to hold their fire. Every shell was precious now. They had fewer than 40 rounds left across all guns. At dawn, the assault came. German tanks rolled forward again, this time supported by infantry armed with Panzerfausts. The American gunners, hidden behind snow berms and sandbags, waited until the last moment before opening fire. The thunder of their 155-millimeter guns shattered the frozen silence. The first volley tore through the lead vehicles. Smoke and flame rose into the air as men shouted orders in German. McCaffrey's forward observers, perched in the treetops, called out coordinates through chattering radios, their fingers nearly frozen stiff. For every shell the Americans fired, the Germans returned tenfold. Mortars rained down, ripping apart the snow and trees. Shrapnel whistled through the air. McCaffrey himself was knocked down twice by concussive blasts, his coat torn, his cap lost. But each time, he rose again. By mid-morning, the smoke was so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing. The battlefield looked like something out of hell. White snow and black smoke blending into a single ashen landscape. At 11 a.m., McCaffrey's second-in-command reported that the last of their ammunition was nearly gone. The men began using captured German shells, adjusting the fuses by hand. A dangerous improvisation that could easily have killed them if misjudged. But it worked. Each round they fired found its mark. A column of half-tracks trying to flank the position was caught in the open and obliterated. The bridge still stood. In those desperate hours, McCaffrey's battalion, fewer than 300 men, held off nearly an entire German regiment. Their guns, blackened from heat and overuse, continued to fire even as their barrels began to warp. When the firing finally ceased, McCaffrey stood at the edge of the line, staring out at the field. The Germans had pulled back to regroup, leaving dozens of wrecked vehicles and countless casualties behind. The snow fell again, quietly covering the ruins. The battlefield went silent once more. That night, McCaffrey allowed himself a moment to rest. He sat by the fire, surrounded by men who had given everything they had. They were running out of shells, fuel, and food, but not resolve. They knew the next day would come, and with it, the next attack. By dawn on December 20th, the men of Captain McCaffrey's artillery battalion were ghosts, hollow-eyed, unshaven, and shaking from exhaustion. The temperature had dropped again, freezing the oil in their guns and stiffening the canvas of their uniforms. Yet they stayed ready. Every man knew the Germans would come again. Scouts reported movement at first light, armor massing beyond the tree line, engines idling low to conceal their strength. McCaffrey climbed to the observation post, a shattered farmhouse barely standing against the wind. Through the haze, he could see them. Dozens of vehicles, columns of infantry, and a single Tiger tank positioned in the center like a king on a chessboard. The enemy had regrouped. This would be the final assault. McCaffrey gathered his officers. Their ammunition was almost gone. Just over a dozen shells left per gun. Reinforcements were still a day away. Retreat was impossible. The bridge behind them had to remain open for the columns of wounded and retreating infantry moving west. He gave one order: hold until the last round. The ground shook as the first German artillery barrage began. Shells screamed overhead and exploded across the valley. Entire trees were uprooted, the snow turning black with soil and smoke. The American gunners hugged the frozen ground as dirt rained down on their helmets. When the barrage ended, silence followed. An unnatural, heavy quiet that lasted only seconds. Then came the tanks. The Tiger advanced first, its gun rotating methodically. Behind it, Panthers and half-tracks moved in formation, infantry fanning out in the flanks. They had learned from the previous days. This time, they came with coordination and overwhelming force. McCaffrey waited. He watched the rangefinder. The Tiger crossed the line he had marked in the snow. He gave the signal. The first American gun fired. The shell hit just short, showering the tank in dirt and snow. The second hit true, slamming into the Tiger's side armor, piercing through and detonating the fuel inside. A fireball erupted into the gray sky. But for every German tank that fell, another rolled forward. The battalion's guns pounded the enemy with their remaining shells, the ground trembling with each shot. The smoke became so thick that it blotted out the sun. McCaffrey's men fought like machines. When one gun overheated, another took its place. When one man fell, another stepped forward to pull the lanyard. By midday, they had destroyed 6 armored vehicles and repelled 3 infantry pushes. But their ammunition was gone. McCaffrey stood behind the last operational gun. He knew this was the end. But before he could order a retreat, he heard the distant whine of engines. Not German, but American. The reinforcements had arrived. From the horizon, a column of Shermans rolled into view, followed by half-tracks and supply trucks. The sound of their approach was like thunder rolling across the valley. The German advance faltered. Under renewed artillery and tank fire, they withdrew into the forest, abandoning their dead and burning machines. McCaffrey's men, covered in soot and ice, collapsed beside their guns. They had done it. Against all odds, they had held the bridge, and with it, the lifeline of the entire front. That night, the stars shone faintly through the haze of smoke. McCaffrey walked alone among the wreckage, his breath visible in the frigid air. The ground was littered with spent shells and broken weapons, silent witnesses to what his men had endured. In 2 days, they had fired nearly 4,000 rounds, destroyed a dozen tanks, and held a position no one thought defensible. Their stand had bought time, time that saved thousands of lives in the chaos of the Ardennes. The morning after the battle was quiet, eerily so. The snow, once churned by tanks and explosions, had settled again into a pale blanket of silence. Smoke rose in thin columns from the wrecks that dotted the valley. The air still smelled of oil, cordite, and burnt steel. Captain McCaffrey stood beside the last gun that had fired. Its barrel was scorched black, its wheels cracked by recoil. Around it, his men moved slowly, cleaning weapons, wrapping frozen fingers in bandages, or simply staring into the distance. None spoke much. They were alive, but barely. The reinforcements that had arrived during the night brought food, blankets, and the first real warmth they'd felt in days. But the cost of survival hung heavy. Nearly a third of the battalion was gone. Some were buried where they fell. Others lay beneath the snow, unmarked but not forgotten. Reports began to arrive from division headquarters. The stand at the bridge had prevented the German 2nd Panzer Division from breaking through to the supply roads leading west. That single artillery battalion had delayed an entire armored column long enough for reinforcements to reorganize the defense. But the officers at HQ wanted details. How McCaffrey had held out with so little ammunition and no armor support. When asked, his reply was simple. "We didn't hold because we could. We held because we had to." The intelligence officers inspecting the battlefield were stunned. The Germans had abandoned more than a dozen vehicles, including 2 Tiger tanks and several half-tracks. Many had been destroyed not by direct fire, but by precise hits that disabled their tracks and fuel tanks. Evidence of disciplined, targeted artillery work under impossible pressure. One observer wrote in his report, "It was not luck that saved them." It was mastery. Later that day, McCaffrey was called to the command post. A farmhouse turned headquarters several miles behind the lines. The general in charge of the sector wanted to see him personally. When he arrived, covered in soot and frost, he was barely recognizable. His uniform was torn, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Yet the general greeted him not with ceremony, but with a quiet handshake. "You saved this army's flank," he said. The recognition meant little to McCaffrey. His thoughts were still with the men buried by the river. That night, as snow began to fall again, he walked back to the line, stopping at each gun pit. He knew every position by heart, the places where his gunners had fired, fallen, and fought on without orders. He paused beside a destroyed 105mm howitzer. Its barrel snapped from a direct hit. In its shadow, someone had placed a helmet atop a shell casing, a quiet marker in the snow. For the first time in days, McCaffrey let the weight of it all sink in. The next morning, the engineers began rebuilding the bridge they had fought so hard to protect. Trucks rolled across, carrying supplies toward the front lines. American tanks followed, heading east once more. The battle for the Ardennes was far from over, but this sector, this narrow river crossing, was secure. McCaffrey's men had achieved the impossible. They had turned a frozen valley into a fortress, and their guns into a wall that no German division could break. When the official report of the engagement reached higher command, it was summarized in a single line. One artillery battalion held the line against a German armored regiment and did not yield. But for the men who lived it, no report could ever capture the truth. They had looked into the face of defeat and refused to blink. The battle was over, but its echoes lingered. The artillery field near the river was now a graveyard of steel, burned tanks, twisted tracks, shattered guns. The snow covered everything, softening the scars but never hiding them completely. Captain McCaffrey and his surviving men were ordered to rest, but few could truly sleep. For days they had lived by the rhythm of firing and reloading, the thunder of their guns their only heartbeat. Now, in the sudden quiet, they found it harder to breathe. In the nearby village, civilians began to emerge from cellars where they had hidden during the fighting. Their faces were pale, their clothes torn, but when they saw the American soldiers, they smiled. Some brought bread and coffee to the weary gunners, offering thanks in broken English and gestures of gratitude. It was then that McCaffrey began to realize what their stand had truly meant. The bridge they'd held had not just saved a road, it had saved lives. Messages from headquarters soon followed. General Eisenhower himself had been informed of the action at the river crossing. The stand was now being used as an example of what discipline and determination could accomplish, even when the odds were hopeless. In one of the official communiques, it was stated, "The 333rd Field Artillery turned desperation into defiance and defiance into victory." But for McCaffrey, glory was meaningless. He wrote in his personal notes, "War is not won by heroes, but by men who do not break when everything else does." As the Army pushed forward once more, McCaffrey's unit was reassigned to provide covering fire for the advancing infantry. Their guns, repaired and rearmed, lined the ridge again, this time not to defend, but to drive the enemy back. The men were quiet, but their confidence had changed. They no longer saw themselves as just another artillery crew. They had faced tanks, mortars, and aircraft, and survived. They now understood the power of precision, of courage under fire. When the order came to fire on a German column retreating through a forested road, they worked in perfect unison, every shot landing with mathematical accuracy. It was no longer about survival. It was about ensuring no one else had to fight the same desperate battle they had endured. Word spread quickly through nearby units. Soldiers who passed through the area stopped to see the bridge of the 333rd. They stood at the riverbank, staring at the ground where the snow still bore faint traces of craters and footprints. The bridge itself, now repaired, stood as both a symbol and a scar, a place where defeat had been turned into defiance. A war correspondent who visited weeks later described it in his report. "The air still smells faintly of gunpowder, and the ground hums with the memory of fire. But there is something sacred about this place, a feeling that courage has left its mark here." For McCaffrey, recognition came quietly. A commendation arrived in the form of a telegram, a citation for leadership and gallantry. But he kept it folded in his jacket, never mentioning it to his men. To him, medals could never replace those who had fallen, the ones who had loaded the last shells, held the line, and never saw the dawn. That night he walked once more to the bridge, now guarded by engineers and patrols. The moonlight reflected off the water, silver and cold. He stood in silence, his breath turning to mist. In the distance, the guns were silent. For the first time in weeks, the Ardennes would remain a place of legend, a frozen hell where men discovered what they were truly capable of. And for one artillery captain, it became the place where duty turned into destiny. But even as victory drew nearer, McCaffrey knew the war was far from over. The enemy was retreating, but not finished. And soon the guns would thunder again. By January 1945, the snow was melting, and with it came the slow realization that the tide had turned for good. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble, was crumbling. The German offensive had failed, and their losses were catastrophic. But for the men who had lived through it, victory felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion. Captain McCaffrey's battery was now part of the counterattack, the great push east that would take the Allies through the Ardennes, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany itself. But before moving forward, McCaffrey received a new order. He and his men were to remain behind for a week to assist with the reconstruction of bridges and roads destroyed during the German advance. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same men who had defended a bridge under fire were now rebuilding others to carry the war forward. It was slow, muddy work, but it gave them purpose. They worked shoulder to shoulder with engineers, locals, and even captured German prisoners. One morning, McCaffrey was approached by an Allied intelligence officer. The man carried a folder thick with reconnaissance photos, pictures showing the results of the artillery strikes his unit had fired during the height of the battle. The officer simply said, "You broke their attack here." The photos showed wrecked tanks, smashed supply vehicles, and abandoned guns scattered along the frozen valley floor. The precision of the American artillery had shattered the German column at its most vulnerable moment. Without that, the bridge would have been taken, and thousands of soldiers, cut off and encircled, might never have escaped. McCaffrey said nothing. He only nodded, staring at the black and white images before folding them back into the folder. But beneath the statistics and reports lay a truth only the men on the ground could understand. Each destroyed tank represented a battle fought in the cold, with trembling hands and frozen faces. Each crater marked a place where men had fallen. In the evenings, when the work was done, McCaffrey's crew would gather by a small fire. They spoke quietly, about home, about friends they'd lost, and about what they would do after the war. Yet none of them truly believed it would end soon. They had been fighting for so long that peace itself felt like a distant dream. A few days later, orders came through. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was to move east toward the Rhine. Their mission, to support the advancing infantry divisions clearing towns along the way. The road ahead was long and dangerous, filled with mines, ambushes, and shattered bridges. Before they departed, McCaffrey walked once more to the rebuilt crossing, the site of their desperate stand. The snow was mostly gone now, replaced by mud and debris, but the scars of battle were still visible: blackened stones, twisted railings, and the faint smell of smoke that lingered in the air. He stood there in silence for several minutes, his mind replaying the chaos, the explosions, the faces of the men who hadn't made it. When the convoy rolled out, McCaffrey's battery rode at the rear, their guns covered in grime, their trucks patched together with spare parts. Yet they carried themselves with a quiet pride. They were no longer just soldiers following orders. They were survivors of one of the fiercest battles of the war. In a letter home, McCaffrey wrote, "We did what we had to do. We didn't break. And that, I think, is what winning really means." As the road wound eastward, the war followed them. Burned villages, wrecked vehicles, and displaced families lined the horizon. The men stared silently out the truck windows, realizing that even in victory, there was little left untouched by destruction. But the bridge they had saved, the bridge that became a symbol of defiance, stood firm behind them, a silent testament to what courage and determination could build amid chaos. They were moving toward the end of the war, but none could know that the worst was yet to come. The Rhine would be crossed, the enemy driven back, but the price of victory would continue to rise. For now, the 333rd moved forward, their guns ready, their hearts heavy, men shaped by fire, marching into history. By late February 1945, the snows of the Ardennes had melted into rivers of mud. The German front was collapsing, but the fighting had not lost its brutality. Across the ravaged countryside, American units pressed forward toward the Rhine, determined to bring the war to its end. Among them moved Captain McCaffrey and his artillerymen, exhausted, hardened, but unbroken. Their mission was simple, but vital: to provide constant fire support for the infantry divisions pushing through the Siegfried Line. The line was Germany's last major defensive wall. Miles of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and minefields designed to halt any invasion. For the artillery, it was a test of precision and endurance. Day and night, McCaffrey's men fired until the barrels of their guns glowed red. They targeted bunkers, supply depots, and fortified positions that blocked the advance. Each shell fired was one step closer to the Rhine, but each explosion also reminded them how far from home they were. McCaffrey had learned to read the rhythm of battle. He could tell, just by the tremor in the ground, whether the enemy was retreating or regrouping. His instincts had saved his men before, and now they guided them through the chaos once again. But as the days passed, the Germans began to fight back with renewed ferocity. The Luftwaffe, though diminished, launched desperate raids on American columns. Artillery duels became common, with German guns firing from hidden positions. Each day brought new casualties, new wreckage. One evening, as the sun set behind the shattered remains of a village, McCaffrey's forward observer radioed an urgent report. A German counterattack was forming just beyond the ridge. Tanks, Panthers and Panzer IVs, supported by infantry, were moving in. McCaffrey acted immediately. He ordered his men to set coordinates and fire for effect. Within minutes, the ridge was lit by the flashes of 105mm guns. Shells arced through the twilight, raining destruction on the advancing enemy. The first salvo caught the German armor as it crested the hill. One tank erupted in flames, another veered off the road, its treads shattered. But the rest kept coming, relentless, like a steel wave. McCaffrey adjusted fire. "Closer," he muttered to himself as if the guns could hear him. The next barrage landed almost on top of his own forward line, dangerously close, but devastatingly effective. When the smoke cleared, the ridge was littered with wrecks. The German counterattack had been broken before it reached the valley. McCaffrey's precise fire had saved the flank. Again, but his success came at a cost. Two of his men had been injured when a counter-battery shell struck near their position. He helped carry one of them to the medics himself, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion. No words were spoken, none were needed. They all knew what survival cost. For the next several days, the 333rd kept advancing, their guns always just behind the front line. McCaffrey barely slept, living on black coffee and adrenaline. His men followed his lead, dirty, weary, but determined. Then finally came the moment they'd been waiting for. In early March, word spread through the ranks. The Allies had reached the Rhine River. The bridge at Remagen had been captured intact. Germany's last great natural barrier had been breached. When McCaffrey heard the news, he allowed himself a rare smile. He stood by one of his guns, the metal still warm from firing, and watched the sun set over the scarred horizon. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time, victory felt real. That night, the men celebrated quietly. They passed around rationed coffee, shared stories, and for a brief moment, let themselves believe in life beyond the battlefield. But as the Rhine loomed ahead, everyone knew that crossing it would be dangerous. The Germans, though beaten back, were far from finished. They would fight for every inch of their homeland. McCaffrey looked east, toward the darkness beyond the river, and whispered to himself, not in pride, but in resolve. The bridge they had once defended in the Ardennes had been only the beginning. Now the greatest crossing of all lay before them. The next morning, the order came through. McCaffrey's battery would move to the riverfront to prepare for the crossing. Their mission, to protect the engineers and infantry who would make the first daring push into Germany. And as the convoy rolled out once more, through mud, ruin, and fading winter fog, Captain McCaffrey felt the weight of history pressing down, knowing that every shell they fired now brought the war closer to its end. By March 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over, but its scars remained. The frozen forests of the Ardennes were silent now, filled with the wreckage of tanks, shattered trees, and memories of men who would never return. Yet for Captain John McCaffrey and his artillerymen, the fight had not ended. It had simply moved east, to the Rhine, to Germany itself, and to the final act of a war that had cost the world everything. At dawn, McCaffrey's unit reached the western bank of the Rhine. Before them stretched one of the most formidable natural barriers in Europe, wide, cold, and swift. On the far side, the remnants of the Wehrmacht waited, determined to defend their homeland to the last man. For weeks, Allied planners had searched for a way across. When the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was found intact, the race was on. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was ordered to support the crossing. McCaffrey's guns were set up on a ridge overlooking the river, their barrels pointed east. Beneath them, engineers worked under fire to strengthen the bridge. German artillery screamed overhead, and fighter bombers strafed the crossing. It was chaos, but amid the smoke and thunder, the Americans kept advancing. McCaffrey's orders were clear: suppress German positions on the far bank at all costs. His men loaded shell after shell, firing at muzzle flashes hidden in the hills. Each explosion lit the night sky, reflected on the river like fire on steel. The Germans fought with desperation, targeting the bridge relentlessly, but the barrage from McCaffrey's battery made it nearly impossible for them to coordinate. Every time the enemy artillery tried to reposition, the Americans were faster. Hours turned into days. The air smelled of cordite and burnt fuel. The bridge shook from impacts but held. Engineers patched holes even as shells landed around them. Through it all, McCaffrey's calm voice guided his gunners. Steady, unflinching, and precise. By the fifth day, the first armored divisions had crossed the Rhine. It was a moment that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The road to the heart of the Reich was open. For McCaffrey and his men, exhaustion gave way to quiet pride. They had survived the Ardennes, held their lines under impossible odds, and now, standing on the banks of the Rhine, they had seen history unfold before their eyes. When the firing finally ceased, McCaffrey walked down to the river's edge. The bridge loomed above him, scarred and blackened, yet still standing, a symbol of endurance, of courage, and of the men who refused to yield. Weeks later, when Germany surrendered, McCaffrey's battery was among those who marched into a land that had once seemed unstoppable. The guns that had thundered through the Ardennes now fell silent. For his actions during the Battle of the Bulge, Captain John McCaffrey received the Distinguished Service Cross. His leadership under fire, his unyielding composure, and his ability to turn chaos into coordination had saved countless lives, and perhaps even changed the course of the battle itself. But when asked later what he remembered most, McCaffrey didn't speak of medals or victories. He spoke of the cold, the fear, and the faces of the men who fought beside him, men who trusted him when the world seemed to collapse around them. Today, historians still debate what turned the tide during those brutal winter months. Some say it was the weather, others the logistics, or the sheer industrial might of the Allies. But for those who were there, men like McCaffrey, it was something far simpler. It was the will to endure. The bridge they defended, the ground they held, the shells they fired. All of it became part of a story greater than themselves, a story of ordinary soldiers who refused to break, even when the night was longest. The Battle of the Bulge remains one of the bloodiest in American history, a struggle fought not just with weapons, but with resolve. And in that frozen hell amid fire and ice, one artillery officer and his men proved what courage truly meant. As the last echoes of war faded over Europe, the guns of the 333rd finally fell silent. The bridge they defended became a monument, not just of steel and stone, but of endurance, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to retreat. The war had taken much from them, but it had also revealed something eternal, that in the darkest moments of history, heroes rise not from glory, but from duty. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.